Given the huge levels of uncertainty over the past 2 years, what's 2022 likely to hold for the healthcare sector?
That's a really good question in terms of, if you look at what the healthcare sector's been through over the last 2 years and, the efforts that have been made to fight COVID-19, what does it mean for healthcare now? I think the biggest thing that we're looking at is the sort of backlogs that we see in terms of procedures, diagnostic tests. We're starting to see anecdotes and evidence of people turning up to hospital that have missed having a disease or an illness picked up early. And we're seeing more serious cases of people when they're turning up to hospital than that should have been the case. There's lots of statistics in the UK around, the size of backlogs as an example, the UK and, mirror it around the world. So COVID is still really impacting utilisation, whether it be from people willing to go to the hospital or doctor, or whether the healthcare systems can manage on top of COVID patients. And again, it's just creating this huge backlog, which needs to be dealt with. So if in 22 we can see a significant reduction in infections, fingers crossed obviously, then healthcare systems can start to deal with these backlogs of patients. It's going to be really, really important next year. I think it's almost like another tragedy around the pandemic. And so, if that does start to correct itself, that's going to be a significant growth in utilisation. So it's going to be a different story and a different focus for us within healthcare compared to the last 2 years.
What specific themes are you looking at over the short term, and how do they compare with those over the longer term?
So the long-term themes, including things like the delivery of healthcare, and innovation, outsourcing, new emerging markets, etc. They've seen, some of those have seen acceleration through COVID, and they will continue to grow over the next several years in terms of importance. The shorter term for me is the opportunities around consolidation. So there's been consolidation in healthcare over the last year and a half, 2 years or so. That has continued, I would argue, a reasonable pace. Healthcare is the most fragmented industry out there, and so there's great rationale for consolidation. The one area that's really seen a big slowdown in M&A is large pharma and large biotech buying smaller biotech and drug companies. There's the reasons for that: policy overhangs. There's been a lot of IPOs. You didn't need to worry about financing, etc., etc. And also, management teams, boards were focused on share prices, maybe going back 10 months ago, which were a lot higher than where they are today, because small cap biotech's generally been quite weak in 2021. So putting that all together, those overhangs, I think, if they're overhangs, they're gone. You're in a timing frame that could be more constructive. And so if there was one thing, if I look in a difference versus long-term history, it's been very quiet in pharma, biotech, M&A. And so potentially shorter term, you could see a real pickup there.
Healthcare stocks have underperformed global equities in 2021. Why?
So the main driver has really been the macro. So we've seen, as the years progress, a real increase in inflation, initially driven by, COVID impacting manufacturing, supply chains, and then, you're seeing it come through on the demand side as well. So when you see that kind of scenario where inflation is accelerating, healthcare doesn't do well as a sector, and so what you tend to see is more a source of funds, and investors are moving into areas that are more sensitive to increasing inflation. If you look deeper into the healthcare, you've seen a really big impact also in small mid caps. So large caps have underperformed, but not by too much. Small mid caps have been really beaten up, and if you look at the difference year to date between them and large cap healthcare, it's over 30%, which is, that's a big number, rarely seen. And I think, we'd hopefully look to see some kind of reverse on that. We'll see, but so, thinking ahead, but the real driver's been the increase in inflation.
With that in mind, what's your outlook for 2022?
So extending, what we just talked about, I think the opportunity for healthcare is strong here. Macro is really important. Can inflation, the rate of change, slow? If it does, that will help attract investment flows out of the most sensitive areas back to areas like healthcare, particularly from the levels of where we stand. The other aspects, if I look at healthcare and think about different pieces sort of to put together for the puzzle, you've got valuation, really attractive here on a relative basis. Fundamentals, we've spent the last several weeks at different conferences, and the messaging from companies is really constructive. The growth outlooks that we can see, the fundamental drivers, really strong. So fundamentals are really good. Then if I look at positioning and ETF flows and such like, they're flagging contrarian buy signals as well. So again, that's constructive. And then the small mid-cap piece, in terms of the weakness there versus large cap, I think it's pretty attractive, justifying small mid-caps on their own. But we're still positive on large cap healthcare. And then finishing it all, what's the growth drivers? The growth of healthcare will look much more similar to the general market next year, whereas sort of more cyclical areas and the global market earnings have been much more significant. You've seen much more significant growth, as you would expect, coming out of what happened in 2020. But with this driver potentially of increased utilisation, because the delayed sort of impact in terms of healthcare and what potentially is going to happen in 22, 23, I think that bodes well for growth of the industry. And so, constructive outlook on healthcare. It's underperformed this year. It could look much better next year.